She had been standing in that hallway for 6 years, invisible. A nurse in blue scrubs, pushing a medication cart, saying good morning to men who never looked up. But the moment that Belgian Malinois walked through the front doors of Hargrove Veterans Medical Center, something shifted. The dog stopped. Every trained instinct in that animal locked onto one person in a corridor full of strangers. He pulled free from a Navy SEAL's grip, crossed 30 feet of polished floor, and sat down at her feet like he had been waiting 7 years to find her. And the SEAL, a man who had survived 3 combat deployments, went completely pale. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because the story you're about to hear is only the beginning. Every week we bring you stories like this one, buried truths, people written off, and the moments that change everything. Drop a like if this already has your attention. And when you're done watching, leave a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The morning shift at Hargrove Veterans Medical Center started the way it always did, with the smell of industrial cleaner, the hum of fluorescent lights warming up, and the sound of someone's breakfast tray clattering against a cart somewhere down the east wing. Nurse Mara Hendricks arrived at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her shift officially began, because she had learned a long time ago that 13 minutes was the difference between being prepared and being caught off guard. She had short, dark hair she kept pinned at the back, and she moved through the hospital corridors the way people move through spaces they have memorized completely. Not rushed, not slow, aware of every doorway and every corner without having to look. The other nurses called it her thing, the kind of quiet efficiency that looked effortless and was anything but. Hargrove was a mid-sized veterans medical facility in Denton, Missouri, the kind of institution that sat in the middle of a city that didn't think much about it. Most of the staff were career civilians. A few had military backgrounds of their own, though most of those were administrative, clerks, managers, people who had done a single enlistment and transitioned out. The doctors were hospital track physicians, good at what they did, and absolutely convinced that good at what they did was the highest possible standard. Mara had been there for 6 years. In those 6 years, she had been passed over for the senior coordinator position twice, had her patient care recommendations ignored 17 times that she'd actually counted, and had sat through a performance review where Dr. Preston Aldridge, the facility's chief medical officer, said to her face that she had a compassionate bedside manner but lacked the clinical authority to drive decisions. She had nodded. She had thanked him. She had gone back to her station and done her job. Nobody at Hargrove knew anything about what she had done before. That was intentional. The morning filled in the way mornings did. She checked vitals in Ward C, managed a medication schedule for 3 post-surgical patients, spent 20 minutes with a veteran named Curtis Bale, who hadn't slept in 4 days and needed someone to sit with him, while the on-call psychiatrist was busy with a different case. Curtis was 53, Army infantry, 2 tours in places that left him jumping at shadows. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. Mara sat in the chair beside his bed, not filling the silence, just occupying it, until his breathing slowed and his hands unclenched. She did that without being asked, and without documenting it as anything more than a routine welfare check, because she knew that if she flagged it as a psychiatric intervention, it would trigger a chain of paperwork that would take 48 hours to resolve and probably result in Curtis getting transferred to a different wing where someone would prescribe him something heavier and leave him more alone. She had learned a long time ago how to work inside systems that didn't understand what they were doing. By 9:15 a.m., she was back at the nurses' station, updating charts. The morning supervisor, Liz Karen, dropped a folder on the counter beside her without looking up from her own screen. "We've got an unusual intake this afternoon," Liz said. "Commander from the Naval Special Operations Community. He's bringing in a retired military working dog for a medical evaluation. The dog needs surgical consultation, shrapnel wound that didn't fully resolve the first time around. Handler is listed as the dog's primary care contact." Mara kept her eyes on her chart. "Who's doing the evaluation?" "Dr. Aldridge assigned it to Dr. Fenn in orthopedics, but Fenn's never worked with a MWD before. I flagged it." Liz finally looked at her. "I thought you might want to be in the room. You know how these veterans are with their dogs. The handler's going to be a handful." "They usually are," Mara said. She took the folder. The dog's name was Scout. A Belgian Malinois, 9 years old, retired from Naval Special Warfare 2 years prior. The shrapnel was in the left hip, a fragment that had shifted over the past 18 months and was now causing mobility issues and visible pain response. The paperwork was dense, a lot of it redacted, and the section that should have listed the dog's operational history was almost entirely blacked out. What she could read said the dog had been attached to a SEAL team designated out of a base in Virginia, had served 4 overseas deployments, and had been medically retired after a mission that resulted in significant trauma to both the animal and multiple personnel. The handler's name was listed as Commander Joel Rask. She read the name twice. Then she closed the folder and set it down on the counter and looked at the far wall for a moment. "Mara?" Liz said. "I'll be there," Mara said. "Text me the room number." Well, she spent the next 3 hours doing her job with her usual precision. She didn't think about the folder. She didn't think about the name. There was a patient in Ward B who needed a wound dressing changed, a family meeting in the consultation room on the second floor that required someone with experience talking to the wives and mothers of men who had come home damaged, and a medication error caught by nobody else that she flagged quietly and corrected before it reached the patient. Dr. Aldridge passed her in the corridor at 11:40 and said, without stopping, "Hendricks, the commander arriving this afternoon is from a sensitive unit. Make sure the intake is smooth. We don't want complaints going back to Naval Command." She said, "Of course, Dr. Aldridge." He kept walking. She noted that he had not asked her whether she had relevant experience with special operations personnel. He had told her to make the intake smooth, the same instruction he would have given a hotel concierge. That was fine. She had been invisible here for 6 years. One more afternoon wasn't going to matter. Joel Rask walked into Hargrove at 2:08 p.m. He was taller than she had expected from the file photo, though she wasn't sure why she'd expected anything at all. He was maybe 40, built like someone who kept himself in shape not for aesthetics, but because he still functioned as a tool he was responsible for maintaining. He wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a plain gray jacket, but he wore them the way people wear clothes when clothes are not the point. His eyes moved when he entered the lobby, not nervously, methodically. 3 seconds to map every exit, every person, every possible problem. Scout walked beside him on a short leash, and the dog moved the same way, deliberate, quiet, head low. The left rear leg had a slight hitch in the gait that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know what healthy movement looked like in a working Malinois. Mara clocked it from 30 feet away. She was standing at the intake desk when they came through the doors. She had Dr. Fenn beside her. Dr. Fenn was 45, orthopedic specialist, no military background, and had spent the past 20 minutes asking questions she had answered twice already because he'd been half listening both times. Rask reached the desk and introduced himself without unnecessary preamble. "Commander Joel Rask, I have a 2:20 appointment for Scout's surgical consultation." "We have you," Mara said. "I'm Nurse Hendricks. This is Dr. Fenn, orthopedic specialist. We'll be taking Scout through intake and then moving to consultation. Is he okay with new environments?" Rask looked at her for a second before he answered, not rudely, more like he was recalibrating something. "He's fine. He reads people, not environments. As long as the people are calm, he's calm." "Understood," she said. "Dr." Fenn stepped forward and extended a hand toward Scout. The dog didn't move away, but he didn't respond either. Flat effect, ears slightly forward, watching Fenn's hand with the kind of patient stillness that made people nervous because it looked like something else. He's not going to bite, is he?" Fenn said. "He's evaluating you," Rask said flatly. "Right," Fenn said. He pulled his hand back. Mara didn't say anything. She made a small sound, not quite a word, and crouched down to Scout's level without reaching toward him. She kept her hands loose at her sides and let the dog come to it on his own. Scout looked at her. Something changed in the dog's posture, not dramatic, a degree or two of tension leaving his shoulders, his weight shifting forward instead of braced. Behind her, she heard Rask go quiet in a way that was different from his previous silence. She stood up. "Let's get him into the consultation room." The consultation took 40 minutes, which was 35 minutes longer than Dr. Fenn had planned for. The imaging showed what the file had suggested. The shrapnel fragment had migrated into a position that was now causing pressure on the joint capsule. Fenn's recommendation was extraction surgery, which was correct, but his proposed timeline and anesthetic protocol were based on a standard domestic patient. He had not accounted for the dog's training, the muscle density, the stress response profile of an animal that had been operationally conditioned for a decade. Mara stood at the edge of the room and said nothing through the first part of the consultation. Then Fenn said, "We'll plan for standard ketamine-based induction, same protocol we use for the civilian animal referrals." "That's not going to work," Mara said. Fenn turned to look at her. "Excuse me?" "Standard ketamine dosing for a dog this size is going to be insufficient. His muscle mass is significantly above average for the breed, and he has a trauma-conditioned stress response, which means his cortisol baseline is elevated. He's going to burn through anesthetic faster than a standard patient. You'll need a higher induction dose and closer monitoring during transition." The room was quiet. Fenn looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been corrected by someone he had not considered capable of correcting him. "I appreciate the input, Nurse Hendricks, but I'll be making the clinical decisions here." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you the clinical decision you're making is going to cause problems." From the corner of the room, Rask said nothing. He was watching her with that same recalibrating look. Fenn straightened. "Unless you have a veterinary degree or specific surgical credentials I'm not aware of, I think we can proceed with the standard protocol." Mara looked at him for a moment. "Could we step outside for a second?" They stepped into the corridor. Fenn crossed his arms. "I understand you're trying to be helpful. His file shows 3 prior anesthetic events in field conditions," she said. 2 of them required above-protocol dosing for adequate sedation. That's documented. It's in the redacted sections that I'm guessing you requested access to and didn't receive. I have the veterinary liaison summary that came with the file." She handed him the paper. He read it. His jaw tightened slightly. "I'll adjust the protocol," he said. "Good," she said. He went back into the consultation room. She followed 30 seconds later. When the consultation wrapped and Fenn went to file the surgical request, Rask stayed in the room with Scout. Mara was completing the intake documentation at the small desk near the window when he spoke. "You know about field sedation protocols," he said. It wasn't a question. She kept writing. "I've worked with military working dogs before." "Where?" "Different assignment," she said. "Combat?" She paused for half a second. The documentation took. He was quiet for a moment. "That's not actually an answer." "No," she agreed. "It's not." Scout had drifted toward her during the consultation. He was now lying on the floor 2 feet from her chair, close enough that his breathing was audible, watching the door with his chin on his forepaws. Rask looked at the dog for a moment with the expression of someone who had learned to trust the dog's judgment over the years in a way that had overwritten some of his own instincts. "He doesn't do that," Rask said. "Do what?" "Get comfortable. Not with strangers. Not this fast." Mara glanced down at Scout. "He's in pain. Animals that are in pain sometimes look for someone they think can help." "He'd have to believe you could help," Rask said. "He doesn't make that call based on nothing." She didn't answer that. She finished her documentation, capped her pen, and stood up. "Surgery is scheduled for the day after tomorrow. I'll make sure the right protocol is filed before Fenn gets into that room. Scout should be fasting from midnight the night before. Do you want to be present for recovery?" "Yes," Rask said. "Then be here at 7 o'clock a.m. I'll make sure you're cleared for the recovery room." She left. Behind her, she heard Rask say something quietly to the dog. She didn't catch the words. She didn't need to. She was at the nurse's station at 4:30 when Dr. Aldridge appeared. He stood across the counter and looked at her with the specific expression she had learned to recognize over 4 years. The one that preceded a conversation she was going to find professionally demeaning. "I heard there was some friction in the canine consultation," he said. "There was a clinical disagreement," she said. "It's been resolved." "Dr. Fenn said you challenged his protocol in front of the patient's handler." "I provided relevant information about the patient's documented anesthetic history and recommended an adjustment to the protocol." She met his eyes. Dr. Fenn agreed with the adjustment. "That's not the issue," Aldridge said. "The issue is professional conduct. You're a nurse. Clinical protocol decisions for a surgical patient are not in your scope." She let the silence sit for a moment. "The adjustment I recommended is consistent with the veterinary liaison documentation attached to the patient file, which Dr. Fenn had not reviewed. He reviewed it after our conversation and changed his protocol accordingly." "That's beside the point. The patient is going to receive correct anesthetic dosing because of that conversation, she said. I'm not sure what point supersedes that one. Aldridge stared at her. He had the specific quality of a man who was used to winning these conversations and didn't have a strong counter available, but also wasn't willing to concede. This is a pattern, Hendricks. You overstep. You have been doing it for 6 years, and I have been patient. But if Commander Rask files a complaint about his animal's care being disrupted by staff conflict, that's going to reflect on this department and on you specifically. Commander Rask seemed satisfied with the consultation, she said. I've made my point, Aldridge said. He left. She went back to her charts. 30 seconds later, her pen stopped moving on the page. She stared at the stack of files in front of her and breathed in through her nose, slow and even, the way she had learned to do in places where losing composure had consequences she could not afford. She had been doing this for 6 years, swallowing it, smiling in the hallway, saying yes when the correct answer was something else entirely. Watching men like Aldridge make decisions she could have made better, and staying in her lane because the alternative was exposing something she had worked very hard to put away. She went back to the charts. The next morning was routine until 10:15, when Liz Karen appeared at her elbow and said, in the careful voice of someone delivering news they weren't sure how to deliver, Commander Rask is at the front desk. He says he forgot to sign one of the surgical consent forms. He's asking specifically for you. She found him at the desk with Scout at his side. The dog looked better this morning, less guarded, which was probably the pain management prescription she'd requested the evening before. Rask slid a form across the counter and pointed to a signature line. This one? She said. That one, he confirmed. She read the form. It was correctly completed. He had not forgotten to sign it. There was nothing missing. She looked up. He was watching her steadily. I wanted to ask you something that wasn't anybody else's business, he said, and I didn't want to do it in a room full of hospital staff. She set the form down. All right. You corrected Fenn yesterday, he said. Not because you read it in a textbook. The way you corrected him. The specificity, the anesthetic detail, the way you talked about cortisol baseline under operational stress, that comes from direct experience. She didn't say anything. I've worked with combat medics, he said. A lot of them. I know how they think. I know how they move. I know the way they watch a room when they walk into it. He paused. You think like a combat medic. The corridor was quiet. 2 nurses passed at the far end without looking their way. I'm a nurse, she said. I know what your badge says. Scout shifted his weight against her leg. She looked down at the dog and then back at Rask. The surgical consent form is correctly signed, she said. You didn't forget anything. No, he said. I didn't. She picked up the form and filed it without another word. When she looked up again, he was still standing there with the careful stillness of a man who had decided to wait her out, and Scout had his head turned toward her with those amber eyes that seemed to be tracking something she hadn't said. Come back at 7 on Thursday, she said. Scout will need you in recovery. She walked away. That evening, she sat in her car in the hospital parking structure for 11 minutes before she started the engine. She had not thought about Operation Ironfield in a long time. She had made an intentional practice of not thinking about it, the way you don't press on a bruise, not because you've forgotten it's there, but because you know what happens when you do. 7 years. She had been 29 years old, attached to a SEAL support unit as a Navy trauma nurse with a secondary designation she had not asked for, and had spent the next 3 years trying to return. They had given it to her anyway because she was the best person available, and the mission had needed the best person available, and that was how the military worked. It found your most exceptional quality and deployed it without asking whether you wanted to be known for it. The mission had gone wrong in the 3rd hour. By the time it was over, she had treated 11 casualties in a space smaller than a hospital room, in the dark, under fire, with equipment designed for 4. She had kept 7 of them alive. 2 of the others had been beyond what any medicine on Earth could have managed. The last 2, she started the engine. The last 2 was not something she was going to sit in a parking structure and think about. What she thought about instead was the dog at her feet in the consultation room. Scout, with his hip that had gone wrong and his careful eyes, lying down next to her like she was something reliable in an unreliable place. She pulled out of the parking structure and drove home. Thursday arrived the way Thursdays did. Too fast, and with complications built in from the previous day. The surgical suite was delayed 40 minutes because of a scheduling overlap, which meant Scout's procedure didn't begin until 8:20, which meant Mara spent an hour and 20 minutes in the prep area with Rask, who sat very still in the way military people sat still when they were managing something that mattered to them more than they wanted to show. "He's going to be fine," she said at one point. "I know," he said. "You're not acting like it." He looked at her sideways. "He pulled me out of a creek bed in Kandahar after I took a round in the shoulder. I was conscious enough to watch him do it. He grabbed my collar and dragged me 10 feet to cover before he went back for the two guys behind me." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't just watch a dog do something like that and go back to thinking of them as assets." "No," she said. "You don't." He turned toward her. "How do you know that?" She looked at the double doors to the surgical suite. "The procedure is starting." It took 45 minutes. The fragment came out clean. Fenn, operating with the corrected protocol, had no complications. Scout came out of anesthesia with slightly elevated agitation in the first 10 minutes, exactly as she had told Fenn to expect, and then settled into normal recovery. Rask was in the recovery room when Scout's eyes opened, and the dog oriented to him immediately, and something in Rask's posture released that he had clearly been holding for the last 2 hours. Mara was standing near the door when Rask looked over at her and said quietly, "Thank you." "Dr. Fenn did the surgery," she said. "That's not what I'm thanking you for." She nodded once and stepped out. She was writing her end-of-shift notes at 5:45 p.m. when the door to the nursing station opened and Dr. Aldridge walked in with a man she didn't recognize. 50s, civilian clothes, but carrying himself with the kind of institutional weight that had nothing to do with the hospital. "Hendricks," Aldridge said. "This is Mr. Gareth Pollock. He's from the Department of Veterans Affairs, Regional Oversight." She put her pen down. Pollock didn't extend a hand. He stood with a folder tucked under his arm and the look of someone who had rehearsed what came next. "We've received a concern about a staff member at this facility potentially misrepresenting their clinical credentials to a patient's primary care contact." She kept her face neutral. "Who filed the concern?" "That's not relevant," Aldridge said. "What's relevant is that there are questions about representations you may have made to Commander Rask regarding your qualifications." "I told Commander Rask I was a nurse," she said, "which I am." "You provided clinical guidance on anesthetic protocol for a surgical patient," Pollock said, "a patient outside your direct care assignment." "I flagged an error in a protocol that would have caused problems during surgery," she said. "The surgeon agreed and corrected it." "The concern," Pollock continued, as if she hadn't spoken, "is that you may have implied a level of expertise you don't have on record, that you may have represented yourself, directly or indirectly, as having military medical credentials you cannot verify." The room was very quiet. She looked at Aldridge, who had the careful expression of a man who had set something in motion and was now watching it play out from a comfortable distance. "My credentials are on file with this hospital," she said. "My nursing license is current. My continuing education certifications are complete." Your nursing credentials aren't in question," Pollock said. "What's in question is whether you led a military officer to believe you had direct combat medical experience that you don't have documented proof of." She said, "And if I did have documented proof of it?" Pollock blinked. Aldridge shifted his weight. "Then that would be a different conversation," Pollock said carefully. She picked up her pen. "I'll finish my notes. If there's a formal complaint, I'll respond through the appropriate channel." "This is the appropriate channel," Aldridge said. "We need to address this now." Then file this complaint formally," she said, "in writing, with the specific allegations listed, and I'll respond to it in writing." She went back to her notes. There was a long pause, then the sound of Aldridge and Pollock leaving the room. She wrote 3 more lines in her notes. Her handwriting was perfectly even. Then she stopped and looked at what she'd written and realized she'd been writing the same patient's name twice because she hadn't actually been paying attention to the page. She closed the folder. Somewhere in this hospital, Scout was sleeping off anesthesia. Rask was probably still in the recovery room, and somebody, Aldridge most likely, possibly with Pollock already in his corner before tonight, had just decided that the most efficient way to handle a nurse who knew too much was to question whether she had any right to know it. 6 years of invisible. And now this. She put her things in her bag, clocked out, and walked to the elevator. The doors opened. Commander Rask was standing inside it, Scout on a short leash beside him, both of them looking like they had been waiting for something. The dog's eyes found her immediately. Rask said, "I need to show you something." He held up his phone. On the screen was a photograph, 7 years old, taken in a place she had spent a long time trying to forget. And in the image, in full kit, carrying a med bag twice the size of anything she'd worked with since, was a person whose face was unmistakable. Her face. "I had a feeling," Rask said quietly. "I called someone who would know." The elevator doors started to close. Neither of them moved. Scout sat down between them like he had already decided how this was going to go. And the fluorescent light above buzzed once, and the photograph on the phone screen was very clear, and everything she had buried for 6 years was about to become impossible to ignore. The elevator doors finished closing, and neither of them reached for a button. The car stayed on the floor for a moment, holding still, and the only sound was the low mechanical hum of the building and Scout's quiet breathing and the distant murmur of the ward somewhere above them. Rask kept the phone screen lit. He didn't wave it at her or make a point of it. He just held it at a neutral angle, the way someone holds evidence they're not using as a weapon yet. Mara looked at the photograph for 4 seconds. It was taken from below and to the right, combat angle. The kind of shot that happens when someone is pointing a camera in a direction and not thinking about composition. She was in full kit, plate carrier, med bag over both shoulders, gloves, a headlamp pushed up on her helmet, catching light from somewhere off frame. Her face was turned slightly toward whoever was down, whoever she was treating, and the expression she wore was one she recognized because she had seen it on other people and knew what it cost. Not calm exactly. Something more specific than calm. The kind of focus that happens when there is nothing in the world except what is immediately in front of you, and everything else has gone to pure noise. She remembered that night. She remembered the specific texture of the ground, and the way the air smelled, and the weight of the pack she was carrying, and the particular quality of the sounds coming from the men around her. She remembered all of it the way you remember things that happen when your nervous system has decided to record everything at maximum resolution because it cannot afford to miss anything. She did not remember anyone taking a photograph. "Who sent this to you?" she said. "Someone I trust," Rask said. "Someone who was there." "Where did they get it?" "From a folder that was supposed to stay buried." He lowered the phone slightly. The mission had unofficial documentation, the kind that happens when someone on the team decides to record everything regardless of orders, because they've learned the hard way that records protect people when the official version gets cleaned up later. The elevator still hadn't moved. She reached past him and pressed the lobby button. "What do you want?" she said. "To understand what happened." He didn't hedge it or soften it. Because something happened to that mission, something happened to the official record of it, and whatever it was, it turned a woman who did something extraordinary into someone nobody's allowed to talk about. The elevator descended. "I'm a nurse," she said. "I work here. I've been working here for 6 years. Whatever you think you see in that photograph, Mara." He said her name quietly, without drama. Scout didn't break a trained protocol and walk across a hospital lobby to lie down at a stranger's feet. He recognized something. He's been doing this for 9 years, and he doesn't make that kind of mistake. The lobby doors opened. She walked out. He followed, Scout's nails clicking quietly on the tile. She stopped near the main entrance and turned to face him. "What do you know about the mission?" "Which one?" She studied his face. "You know which one." He was quiet for a moment. "I know the designation. I know the unit. I know there was a trauma specialist attached to the team who isn't named in any official after-action report, and I know 3 people from that team have spent the last 4 years trying to find out why." He paused. "I know one of those people is a friend of mine who nearly died that night, and when I described you to him, the way you moved in that consultation room, the way you talked about Scout's stress response, he told me to show you the photograph." She looked at the floor between them. Scout pressed his nose gently against the back of her hand. "I have to go home," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying anything tonight. I'm not asking you to." She looked up at him. There was no pressure in his expression, and that was worse in some ways than pressure would have been, because it meant he was willing to wait, and people who were willing to wait were more dangerous than people who demanded things immediately. "Surgery went well," she said finally. "His gait should improve significantly once the inflammation resolves. 2 weeks of restricted movement, then gradual reintroduction to normal activity. I'll leave detailed instructions at the discharge desk. Mara, good night, Commander. She pushed through the main doors into the evening air. She didn't sleep well. That wasn't unusual. She hadn't slept well in a long time, the kind of long time that had become so normal she'd stopped marking it as a problem. She lay in her apartment, which was a place of deliberate minimalism. No decorations on the walls that meant anything, furniture that was functional and nothing else, and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the building settling around her. The photograph. She hadn't seen it before. She'd assumed there were no photographs, that the things she'd asked to be kept quiet had been kept quiet because people had done what they said they would do. 7 years of believing that the silence was complete. It wasn't. Somewhere, in some folder that had survived the classified cleanup, her face was attached to that night, and now that face was on Rask's phone, and Rask was connected to people who had been there, and the careful compartment she'd built was beginning to develop cracks. She thought about Aldridge, about Pollock and his folder, about the specific phrasing Pollock had used, misrepresenting clinical credentials, and the way Aldridge had stood behind it with that flat, satisfied expression of a man who believed he'd found the right lever. They were wrong about the lever, but the fact that they were pulling it at all meant something had shifted, and shifts had a way of accelerating once they started. She got up at 4:30 and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with her hands around the mug and thought about 7 years of doing things the right way, the quiet way, the way that didn't ask for anything and didn't threaten anyone, and whether 6 years of that particular strategy had run its useful life. She had made a decision once, after the mission, after the debrief that wasn't really a debrief but was more accurately described as a series of instructions about what she would and would not say going forward. She had decided that she was done. Not with nursing. She had always wanted to be a nurse, had always known that was the thing she was built for in the most fundamental sense. But done with the other thing, the thing that had turned her into someone she didn't recognize, the thing that had put her in that photograph with that expression on her face. She had walked away cleanly. She had rebuilt herself inside a hospital system that would never look at her and see what she used to be. She had been safe. She thought about Curtis Bale, who hadn't slept in 4 days, and who nobody was sitting with because they were too busy. She thought about the veteran in Ward C whose medication had nearly been wrong, and the family in the consultation room who had needed someone to tell them the truth about what was ahead without burying it in clinical distance. She thought about Scout, who had walked across a lobby floor with a bad hip and a decade of operational stress behind him, and had somehow decided she was the safest thing in the room. She poured the rest of the coffee down the sink and went to get ready for work. The formal complaint was on her station desk when she arrived at 6:55 a.m. It was printed on VA oversight letterhead, 4 paragraphs, dry language, and it accused her of providing unsolicited clinical guidance in a domain outside her credentialed scope, potentially misleading a military patient's primary handler regarding staff qualifications. Liz was at the adjacent desk and didn't say anything when Mara picked it up and read it. Liz was good at knowing when silence was the right contribution. Mara read it twice, set it face down on the desk, and started her morning rounds. By 9 o'clock a.m., word had moved through the ward the way word moves through small institutional communities. Not announced, not even fully discussed, just absorbed, the way humidity is absorbed, until everyone knew without knowing who had told them. The looks she got ranged from sympathetic to carefully neutral, to the specific look of people who had privately agreed with something they would never say aloud. There were 2 nurses who went out of their way to find something to do in the opposite corridor when she came through. That was fine. She had not expected loyalty from people who were also managing their own risk. Dr. Aldridge appeared at 10:15 for what he clearly intended to be a decisive conversation. He found her in the medication prep room and closed the door behind him with the quiet firmness of someone who wanted an audience but also wanted the appearance of professionalism. "The complaint has been filed," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to give you the opportunity to respond before this escalates further." She measured a dosage and transferred it to the labeled cup. "What would a response look like to you?" "An acknowledgement that you overstepped," he said. "A commitment to stay within the boundaries of your role going forward. We can manage this quietly if you're willing to be reasonable about it." She looked at him. "And if I'm not willing to be reasonable about it?" He shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. "Then it becomes a formal personnel matter, and the outcome is less predictable." "For whom?" He blinked. "Less predictable for whom, Dr. Aldridge?" she said. Because you filed a complaint with VA oversight alleging I misrepresented credentials I may actually have. If the investigation goes forward and discovers that the representation I made was accurate, the complaint doesn't just fail, it raises questions about why it was filed. He was very still. I'd encourage you to think carefully about what an investigation actually turns up, she said. She picked up the medication tray. Excuse me, I have a patient. She left him standing in the medication prep room. Her hands were completely steady. She was surprised by that because under the steadiness there was something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. A particular quality of alertness. The sense that the room had finally decided to become a problem, and she had finally stopped pretending it wasn't. Ras came back to the hospital at noon. He didn't have an appointment. He came in through the main entrance with Scout on the leash, the dog moving better already, with just 24 hours of proper pain management and rest. And he asked for Mara at the front desk with the calm directness of a man who had decided on a course of action and was not interested in detours. She met him in the corridor outside Ward C because that was where she happened to be, and because she saw him before the desk called her and made a decision in approximately 2 seconds about whether to have this conversation now or keep deferring it. You have 15 minutes, she said. I have a patient at noon 15. That's enough, he said. They walked to the end of the corridor away from foot traffic. Scout padded alongside, his attention splitting evenly between monitoring the environment and watching her. His name is Marcus Vale, Rask said. Petty Officer First Class, retired. He was on the extraction team that night. He's the one who found the photograph. He paused. He's also the one who asked me to come back. She looked at the wall. How is he? Physically, decent. Mentally, he's carrying a lot. He's been carrying it for 7 years, and he's been carrying part of it for you because he always believed you got a bad deal, and he never had any way to do anything about it. She was quiet for a moment. What does he want? He wants to know if you're okay. Rask said it simply, without sentimentality. And he wants to know if you know what happened to the official mission record, because it didn't just get cleaned up. It got specifically altered, and the alterations protected someone. And Marcus has spent 4 years trying to figure out who. The corridor hummed with the distant sound of hospital activity. Someone pushed a cart past the far end. A phone rang twice and stopped. I know what happened, she said. He waited. I was told not to discuss it. She turned to look at him directly. I was told specifically by someone with sufficient rank to make that instruction binding that the events of that night would remain classified and that my involvement would remain undocumented. I agreed to those terms because at the time it seemed like the right call and because I was… She stopped. Because I was done. I wanted to be done. And now? Now someone filed a complaint with VA oversight trying to use the absence of my documented credentials against me, she said. Which is interesting because the reason my credentials aren't documented is the same reason I'm not in the mission record. He absorbed that. Someone is using the cover-up to come after you. Someone is using the cover-up to shut me up, she said, which implies they know I'm here, and they know I've been talking to you, and they're concerned about what that might produce. The weight of that landed between them. The complaint was filed by Gareth Pollock, she said. He's listed as VA Regional Oversight. I'd suggest running that title against Naval Administrative Records before you take it at face value. Something shifted in Rask's expression. Not alarm exactly. More like the look of someone who has been watching a pattern develop and has just seen one more data point confirm the shape of it. How long have you known, he asked, that someone was watching since the day you walked in? She picked up her pace slightly, heading toward her noon patient. Get Marcus Vale's contact information to me through a channel that isn't this hospital's internal system, and run Pollock's name. She turned into the patient room without looking back. She found out about Marcus Vale's medical file by accident, which was actually how she found out about most things that mattered. Not through intention, but through the ordinary mechanics of doing her job and paying attention. She was cross-referencing records in the system at 2:15 p.m. when she ran a standard search for documentation related to Scout's aftercare instructions, and the system flagged a concurrent record request from an external terminal, a records pull on a patient name she hadn't entered. The flag was a system glitch, the kind of administrative bleed that happened in underfunded hospital IT infrastructure, and under normal circumstances it would have meant nothing. The name on the pulled record was Marcus Vale. He was a patient here. Not at Hargrove specifically, but in the VA system, which meant his medical records were accessible within the same regional network. And someone, not her, not Rask, not anyone she could identify from the terminal code, had pulled them 40 minutes ago. She didn't touch the flag. She documented her own search, closed the cross-reference, and went back to her charts. She thought about Pollock, who was supposedly regional oversight, pulling a patient record for a man whose name she had heard for the first time 90 minutes ago. That timeline didn't work unless Pollock had been monitoring her conversation with Rask in a hospital corridor, with no obvious surveillance infrastructure, which meant either the hospital itself was wired in a way she hadn't accounted for, or someone had physical proximity they hadn't revealed. She went through the rest of her afternoon with that thought running at low volume underneath everything else, not urgent enough to act on immediately, persistent enough that she couldn't set it aside. She watched the corridors differently. She took note of the people she passed who didn't have specific reasons to be in specific places. She hadn't done that kind of tracking in 6 years, and it came back with the ease of something that had never actually left, just gone dormant, like a skill packed carefully away. At 3:50, she saw a man she didn't recognize standing near the elevator bank on the second floor. He was in civilian clothes, holding a coffee cup, looking at his phone. Nothing remarkable about any of that individually. What was remarkable was that he had been in the same position 22 minutes earlier when she came through that corridor, and the coffee cup looked exactly as full as it had been the first time. Nobody stands in one place for 22 minutes in a busy hospital and drinks no coffee. She kept walking. She didn't alter her pace. She rounded the corner and took the stairs down to the first floor and went to the supply room and stood in there for 30 seconds, which was long enough to make sure nobody had followed her and short enough that her absence wouldn't register as unusual. Then she went back to her work. Rask texted her at 5:30 from a number she didn't have saved. The message said, "Pollock isn't VA oversight. He's a private contractor with a defense consulting firm that holds contracts with naval special warfare. Marcus says he's seen that name before on documents related to the mission. He's on his way to Denton. Should be there tomorrow." She read the message in her car, in the parking structure, with the engine running. She texted back, "Someone pulled Marcus's medical record from the regional VA system this afternoon. They're already here." 3 minutes passed. Then, how did they know about Marcus? She thought about the corridor, about the timing of Pollock's appearance, which had been 24 hours after Rask arrived, which meant someone had flagged Rask's intake at this hospital and started moving within a day, which meant the flag had been standing, not reactive, not triggered by her specifically, but pre-existing. Someone had been watching for Rask, or someone had been watching for Scout. She typed, "the dog." The surgical intake was logged in the VA system when the appointment was made. If someone had a standing alert on Scout's service record, they'd have known before Rask even arrived. Another pause, then, "That's not a small operation." "No," she typed back. "It isn't." She put the phone in her bag and sat for a moment in the parking structure's particular silence, concrete and exhaust and distant traffic, and felt the shape of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear exactly. Closer to the particular clarity that comes when the situation becomes simple, when all the ordinary context falls away, and what's left is the actual problem and the actual stakes, and the question of what you're willing to do about it. 6 years of quiet. 6 years of invisible. Someone had just reminded her why she'd tried to disappear in the first place, and in doing so had made staying disappeared impossible. She drove to the VA Regional Records Office the next morning before her shift started. She arrived at 7:15, which was 15 minutes before standard opening, and waited in the parking lot. When the administrative clerk unlocked the front door at 7:29, she went in with her hospital ID, her nursing credentials, and a records request form she had printed at home at 6:00 a.m. She requested Marcus Vale's record access log. Standard procedure. Any patient could request documentation of who had accessed their file. It was a right. It was documented. The clerk processed it without comment and told her it would take 48 hours to compile. Then she drove to the hospital. Liz was already at the station when she arrived. Liz handed her a note without commentary, and the note said, in administrative handwriting, that she had been requested for a meeting with Dr. Aldridge and a representative from VA Oversight at 10:00 a.m. She read the note. She folded it. She put it in her pocket. "Everything okay?" Liz said. It will be, Mara said. She started her morning rounds. She went through them methodically. She sat with Curtis Bale for 12 minutes because he'd had another bad night. She changed 2 dressings. She caught a documentation error on a post-surgical chart that would have caused a billing problem, but not a patient harm. Normal work. The work she came here for. At 9:50, she went to the second-floor conference room. Aldridge was already there. Pollock was beside him, folder on the table, same careful expression. There was a third person, a woman Mara didn't recognize, dark blazer, legal pad, no introduction offered. Sit down, please, Aldridge said. She sat. We've reviewed the formal complaint, Pollock said. We'd like to give you the opportunity to address the allegations before we move forward with formal personnel action. What specific personnel action? She said. Suspension, pending investigation, Aldridge said, followed by a credentialing review that will determine whether your position here remains appropriate. She looked at him. On what grounds? Misrepresentation of clinical expertise to a military patient's handler, Pollock said, and conduct unbecoming a medical professional. Conduct unbecoming, she repeated. You implied military medical credentials you cannot document, Pollock said. You used that implied authority to influence a surgical protocol decision. And you have created an adversarial dynamic with this institution's chief medical officer that suggests a pattern of disregard for, I'd like to see the formal complaint in writing, she said, signed with the complainant identified. That's not standard process for a personnel action of this severity requires a written, signed complaint from an identified party, she said. That's VA Administrative Procedure 3.1.7. If you're proceeding without that, the action itself is procedurally invalid. The woman in the dark blazer made a note on her legal pad. Pollock's jaw tightened. We can produce the appropriate documentation. Good, Mara said. I'll also need documentation of Mr. Pollock's current VA oversight credentials, including his authorization code for this regional jurisdiction, because VA regional oversight representatives are listed in the Public Administrative Directory, and I wasn't able to locate his listing this morning. Silence. Aldridge looked at Pollock. Pollock looked at the folder. The woman in the blazer had stopped writing. Mr. Pollock, Mara said, are you currently employed by the Department of Veterans Affairs? Pollock straightened. I am a contracted representative. Contracted by whom? Another silence. This one longer. She let it sit. She had learned a long time ago that silence was a tool and most people couldn't stand to leave it unfilled. I think, the woman in the blazer said, and her voice was careful, the voice of someone managing a situation that had begun to deviate from the plan. We should take a short recess to allow all parties to gather their documentation. That's fine, Mara said. I'll wait. She sat back and folded her hands on the table. The 3 of them filed out of the room. She heard the sound of urgent, low-voiced conversation starting before the door had fully closed. She sat alone in the conference room and looked at the far wall and thought about Marcus Vale on his way to Denton. She thought about the man with the coffee cup on the second floor who hadn't been there this morning when she'd walked through. She thought about Scout, somewhere in Rask's care, walking better than he had 4 days ago, and the look in the dog's eyes when he'd pressed his nose against her hand in the lobby. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen under the table. Rask. A message with no text, just a file attachment. She opened it. It was a document. Not the photograph. Something else. Official letterhead, date stamped 7 years back. And at the top, in the dense institutional language of classified military administrative communications, her name, her actual designation, and a description of her role in an operation that had officially never included her. Someone had not buried everything after all. She read it twice. The third time, she read only the final paragraph, which contained a sentence that made the back of her neck prickle in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The sentence said that the decision to remove her from the official record had not been made by Naval Command. It had been made by a civilian contractor with authorization from a defense oversight body whose name appeared one more time in the document. A name she recognized, a name that was, at this moment, somewhere down the hall, in urgent conversation with a hospital administrator and a woman with a legal pad. The conference room door opened. Pollock came back in alone. He had left his folder in the hall. His expression had changed in the 12 minutes he'd been gone. The careful professional surface had thinned, and underneath it was something harder and less managed. "I think," he said, "we've gotten off on the wrong foot." "I think," Mara said, "you accessed Marcus Vale's medical record from this hospital's regional network yesterday afternoon without patient authorization or clinical justification." He stopped moving. "I think you've been monitoring Naval Special Warfare personnel movements through the VA scheduling system," she continued. "I think you identified Commander Rask's intake appointment before he arrived, and I think you were here before the complaint was filed, not after it, which means the complaint was not a response to a concern. It was a mechanism. You built the concern around a tool you were already planning to use." He was very still. "I have a records request pending with the VA regional office for the access log on Marcus Vale's file," she said. "That log will show a terminal access code. Terminal access codes are assigned to individual user accounts. User accounts are tied to identities." She watched him. "How long do you think it takes to pull a thread like that before the whole thing comes apart?" Pollock sat down across from her. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked like a man who had miscalculated something. "You don't understand what you're getting into," he said. "I've been in it for 7 years," she said. "I just didn't know it." Outside the conference room window, she could see the parking lot. A dark SUV she hadn't noticed that morning was parked at the far edge, engine running, no one visibly inside. She looked back at Pollock. "Tell me something," she said. "The operation that night, the one you had my name removed from. Did you think I was going to stay quiet forever, or did you just think it didn't matter whether I did or not?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly and without any of the professional tone he'd walked in with, "I thought you wanted to disappear." "I did," she said. She stood up. "That was before you showed up at my hospital and tried to take the one thing I had left." She walked to the door. She had her hand on the handle when she heard him say, from behind her, "There are people involved in this who are not going to respond well to what you're doing." She opened the door. "I know," she said. She walked back into the hallway. 20 feet away, standing at the end of the corridor with Scout at his side and a phone in his hand, and an expression on his face she had not seen before, not the careful, recalibrating look of the past 3 days, but something sharper, something that had arrived with specific information, was Commander Joel Rask. He held up the phone. On the screen was a photograph she had not seen, not the one from 7 years ago, but something new, something taken in the last 48 hours. And the face in it was not hers. It was Marcus Vale's. And Marcus Vale was not on his way to Denton. Marcus Vale was in a hospital. 3 states away, he had been admitted 6 hours ago under circumstances that the admitting notes described in the bloodless language of institutional paperwork as a fall. The kind of fall that happened to people who had been asking the wrong questions for too long. Mara looked at the photograph and then at Rask, and something inside her that had been held carefully in place for 6 years. The decision, the agreement, the careful distance she'd kept from everything she used to be, came apart with the particular quiet of something that has been under pressure for a very long time and has finally found the place where it gives. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at the photograph on Rask's phone. Marcus Vale's face, the hospital admission timestamp, the clinical notes that use the word fall the way people use words when they have agreed not to say something else. And then she handed the phone back to him and turned and walked down the corridor toward the stairwell. "Mara, walk with me," she said, without stopping. He caught up. Scout matched pace on her left side, and she was aware of the dog's presence the way she had been aware of her team's presence in other corridors and other situations. Peripheral, steady, a form of information she absorbed without looking directly at. She took the stairs to the ground floor. She moved through the side corridor toward the records annex, which was the quietest part of the building at this hour, and pushed through the door and let it close behind them. "Tell me exactly what you know," she said. "Not what you think. What you know." Rask pulled up the information on his phone and read from it precisely, without editorializing, the way people read when accuracy matters more than delivery. Marcus Vale had been admitted to Kellerman Regional Medical Center in Ashford, Nebraska at 1:47 a.m. the previous night. Admitting diagnosis was blunt force trauma to the left temporal region, bruised ribs on the right side, and a laceration on his left forearm consistent with a defensive wound. He had been found at the base of a stairwell in his apartment building by a neighbor who heard the impact. He was in stable condition but had not yet been interviewed by police because he was intermittently unconscious. The neighbor had said Marcus was carrying a box of files when she'd last seen him 2 hours before he was found. There were no files at the scene. He was sending material, Mara said. He told me yesterday morning he was digitizing everything, Rask said. The physical copies, the photographs, the informal documentation. He was planning to move it somewhere safe before he came to Denton. Whoever is running Pollock moved first. It looks that way. She put her back against the wall and crossed her arms and thought through it the way she'd learned to think through developing situations. Not from where she was standing, but from above, topographically, the whole terrain at once. Pollock's presence here. The standing alert on Scout's VA record. The speed with which the complaint had been filed. The SUV in the parking lot with its engine running. This was not improvised. This had infrastructure. How many people knew Marcus was compiling that material, she said. As far as I know, me and 2 other people from the team, neither of them would have said anything. Communications? He understood the question. He was using a clean phone bought last week. His regular phone. Rask was quiet for a moment. His regular phone was at home, which meant someone was monitoring his regular communications and had seen enough, a reference, a name, a conversation fragment, to know he was moving. Not what he had necessarily, but that he was moving. I need to reach him, she said, directly. Not through you and not through any channel that's touched a network Pollock has access to. He's intermittently unconscious. Then I need someone at that hospital who isn't connected to this. She thought for a second. Does he have family? A sister in Omaha, Denise Vale. She's a school teacher. She's not involved in any of this. Call her, not from your regular phone. Tell her to go to the hospital and to physically hold on to anything Marcus brought with him. Bag, clothing, anything. Don't let the hospital put it in storage. Don't let anyone she doesn't know take anything from the room. Tell her it matters. He was already reaching for his pocket. What are you going to do? She pushed off the wall. I'm going to find out who Pollock actually works for. The woman in the dark blazer had not left the hospital. Mara found that out from Liz, who found it out from the front desk, which was where Liz found out most things in this building. The woman was in Dr. Aldridge's office on the 3rd floor, had been for the past 40 minutes, and had sent someone to retrieve Aldridge's credentialing files from the administrative archive. That was interesting. A woman present to manage a personnel complaint against a nurse did not need the credentialing files of a chief medical officer. That was a different investigation entirely. Mara went back to her nursing station, sat down, and opened the hospital's internal administrative directory on her workstation. She looked up the third-party contractor registry, every external body that had authorized access to Hargrove's institutional systems. The VA maintained a list. Contractors were required to be registered. There were 22 entities on the current list, ranging from medical equipment suppliers to pharmaceutical auditors to a regional healthcare consulting group. She scrolled through the consulting group's registered personnel. Gareth Pollock was not on it. She went back further, checked the previous 18 months of registry updates, and found a registration added 4 months ago for a firm called Meridian Institutional Advisors. The registration was sparse: 1 contact name, a Virginia mailing address, and a scope of services description that said Administrative Oversight and Compliance Review for Federal Healthcare Contractor Relationships. She searched Meridian Institutional Advisors in the Public Business Registry. Incorporated 14 months ago. Single registered agent, no public-facing website. The Virginia address was a registered agent service, the kind of address that existed to give shell companies a physical location without actually housing anyone. She printed the registry page. She folded it and put it in her pocket. Then she thought about the document Rask had sent her that morning, the classified administrative record that had her name on it, that named the civilian contractor who had authorized her removal from the mission documentation. She had not written down that name because she had not needed to. It had gone directly into the part of her memory that filed things it was not going to let go of. Talford Strategic Group. She ran that through the public registry. Incorporated 21 years ago. Defense Consulting. Multiple federal contracts, most of them listed only by contract number with no description. A board of directors with 6 names, none of which were Gareth Pollock. She searched Pollock's name against Talford directly. No result. Then she searched the registered agent for Meridian Institutional Advisors against the Talford Board of Directors. One match. She sat back in her chair and looked at the screen. Meridian was a subsidiary. Pollack was not a direct employee of Talford. He was an operative running through a shell, which meant there was a deliberate buffer between what he was doing here and the people who had authorized it. That kind of structure was not built for routine compliance work. It was built for situations where the people at the top needed distance from the outcome. She pulled the printed page from her pocket and wrote the name across the bottom in her own handwriting. Then she took out her phone and texted Rask. Meridian Institutional Advisors, Virginia Shell. Parent company is Talford Strategic Group. Talford is named in your document. Pollack is running through a subsidiary to create distance. This is not a compliance operation. She hit send. His response came in 40 seconds. I know that name. Talford had embedded personnel with Naval Special Warfare oversight for the period that included Ironfield. Marcus flagged them in his notes. She read it twice. Then she stood up, collected her things, and went to do something she had been putting off for 6 years. The hospital chaplain's office was on the first floor near the chapel, which was a room nobody used much except as a quiet place to sit when the rest of the building felt too loud. The chaplain, Father. She went to the records room instead. Her own personnel file was stored in a locked cabinet in the HR annex. She had the right to access it. It was her file. She requested it from the HR clerk, a young man named Phil, who looked mildly alarmed by the request but processed it correctly, and she sat down at the reviewing table and opened it. Her nursing credentials were there, her certifications, her 6 years of performance reviews, including the one where Aldridge had written lacks clinical authority to drive decisions, and the one before that where her previous supervisor had written exceptional situational awareness and patient advocacy skills, and the one before that which simply said recommended for advancement, and which Aldridge had apparently overridden without documentation. At the back of the file, behind the standard employment forms, was a single sheet she had put there herself when she was hired. A personal disclosure she had been asked to complete about prior employment history. She had listed her Navy service. She had listed the years. She had listed her designation as a Navy nurse, which was accurate and true, and she had not listed anything beyond that because she had been explicitly instructed not to, and the instruction had been binding. She looked at the sheet. Then she took out her phone and called a number she had memorized 11 years ago and had never used. It rang 4 times. She was halfway to deciding it no longer worked when someone picked up. Silence on the other end. Then, I was wondering when this call was coming. The voice belonged to Commander Sylvia Hartwell, retired. She had been Mara's commanding officer for the last 18 months of Mara's active service, and she was the person who had given Mara the instruction about what would and would not be disclosed. And she was also the person who had said, at the end of that conversation, if the day comes when it stops being a protection and starts being a weapon used against you, you call me. That day came, Mara said. Tell me. She told her. Concisely, in the order that mattered. Rask, the photograph, Pollack, Meridian, Talford, Marcus. She didn't editorialize. She gave Hartwell the facts the way she'd learned to brief, the way that required the listener to bring their own analysis rather than having it handed to them. When she finished, Hartwell was quiet for a moment. Talford, she said. Yes. They've been quiet for a long time. Not anymore. Another pause. Marcus Vale's condition? Stable, unconscious intermittently. His sister is en route. The material he was compiling, possibly taken, possibly not. He may have digitized before they moved on him. We don't know yet. Hartwell made a sound that was not quite a sigh, more like the sound of someone recalibrating a position they've been holding. What do you need from me? The full mission record, Mara said. The unaltered version, not the document Rask has, the primary file, the one that was never supposed to exist. Silence. Sylvia, Mara said, I know you kept it. That's a significant assumption. You told me if it ever stopped being a protection, you wouldn't have said that without having something to back it up. The silence stretched for another 4 seconds. I'll need 24 hours, Hartwell said. I may not have 24 hours. 18 then. Don't do anything irreversible before I call you back. The line went dead. Mara sat in the HR annex for a moment with the phone in her hand and her personnel file open in front of her, and she thought about the word irreversible and what it meant in this context and what she was already committed to that might qualify. She closed the file. She returned it to Phil, who looked like he had been hoping she would finish before his lunch break. She thanked him and went back to her floor. Aldridge found her at 2 p.m. He came to the nurse's station with the specific energy of a man who had received new information and was deciding how to use it, which was a different quality than his usual administrative authority. He stood across the counter and said, without his normal preamble, "The oversight representative has asked to speak with you again, this afternoon." "Pollock," she said. "Ms. Yara Brink, the other representative, the woman in the dark blazer." "What capacity is she operating in?" Mara said. Aldridge hesitated slightly. "She's from the Inspector General's office." Mara looked up from her chart. "Which IG?" "Defense." She set her pen down. The Department of Defense Inspector General was not the same thing as VA Regional Oversight. It was not in the same category, the same jurisdiction, or the same league. If Yara Brink was from the DoD IG, she was not here to manage a personnel complaint against a nurse. She was here investigating something that had started before any of them arrived at this hospital. "When?" Mara said. 3 o'clock. "Where?" "Conference room B." She nodded. Aldridge stood there for a moment, as if he expected something more, some sign of alarm or resistance. And when she went back to her chart without providing it, he left. Liz appeared at her elbow 30 seconds later. "DoD IG," she said quietly. "Yes." "That's not about you." "No," Mara agreed. "It's not." She thought about Pollock's face when she'd named Meridian, the way the managed surface had slipped, the way he'd said, quietly and without professional gloss, "I thought you wanted to disappear." That was not the response of a compliance operative. That was the response of someone who had made a decision about a person and was surprised to find the person still had opinions about it. She thought about Brink arriving at this hospital at the same time as Pollock, both of them ostensibly representing oversight, clearly operating from different directions. Which meant either Brink was genuine and Pollock's presence had triggered her involvement, or they were operating in coordination, and the coordination was more complex than anything a routine personnel complaint would require. She pulled out her phone under the desk and texted Rask, "DoD IG representative named Yara Brink. Was she in your documents?" He responded in 3 minutes, "No." But Marcus mentioned an internal investigation that was opened and then quietly closed 4 years ago. If it was reopened, she typed, "Find out, quickly." She put the phone away and went to check on Curtis Bale, because Curtis had a 2:30 appointment with the on-call psychiatrist, and he tended to disappear when appointments felt like they were being managed for someone else's benefit rather than his own. And she had learned that showing up in person 20 minutes beforehand was the difference between him being there and not. He was there. He looked at her when she knocked on the doorframe and said, "You look like something's wrong." "I'm fine," she said. "No, you're not." He said it flatly, without meanness. "You've got the same thing on your face that guys get before a bad op. Like you know what's coming and you're deciding how to be okay with it." She leaned against the doorframe. "Dr. Ferris will be here at 2:30. "I know," he said. "I'll be here." He watched her. "You a veteran?" She looked at him for a moment. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Thought so." He didn't ask anything else. He turned back toward the window, and she left him there, and she thought about the fact that Curtis Bale, who had not slept in 4 days and carried his war in every room he entered, had seen through 6 years of hospital corridor and blue scrubs in about 30 seconds. At 2:55, she went to conference room B. Brink was already there. No Pollock, no Aldridge. Just Brink, 2 bottles of water on the table, a recorder that was visibly switched off, and the legal pad from this morning that was now significantly more full than it had been. Brink gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down, please." Mara sat. Brink was somewhere in her mid-40s, and she had the quality of someone who had been doing something difficult for a long time and had found a way to be at peace with the difficulty without pretending it was easy. She didn't lead with authority, and she didn't lead with warmth. She led with directness. "I'm going to tell you why I'm here," she said. "And then I'm going to ask you some questions. and I need you to understand before I ask them that I am not your adversary." "All right," Mara said. "Talford's strategic group has been under investigation by the DoD Inspector General's office for the past 19 months, Brink said. The investigation originated with a procurement fraud allegation and expanded when the financial audit turned up a pattern of payments to former naval personnel that didn't correspond to any documented consulting work." She paused. "Some of those payments corresponded to specific dates. One of those dates was the date of a classified naval special warfare operation 7 years ago." Mara kept her expression level. "Operation Ironfield." Brink looked at her steadily. "You know the name." "I was there." Brink's pen moved to the legal pad. "I know. That's why I'm here." She set the pen down. "The official mission record for Operation Ironfield lists 9 personnel. The financial records we've pulled suggest there was a 10th. The payments made on the date of the operation included an amount that doesn't correspond to any of the 9 listed personnel, and the routing suggests it was a suppression payment, money paid to someone to ensure something wasn't documented." "It wasn't a payment to me," Mara said. "I know that too." Brink's voice was even. "The payment went to someone inside Naval Administrative Command who processed the personnel records, someone who removed a name." The air in the room was very still. "Who authorized it?" Mara said. "A Talford executive with embedded advisory status and naval oversight," Brink said. "Someone who had access to mission documentation and the authority to flag personnel records for reclassification." She watched Mara carefully. "That person is still active, still embedded." "You're telling me because you think I can help you." "I'm telling you because you're already in the middle of it, and you have been for a week without knowing the full picture," Brink said. "Pollock was sent here to neutralize a potential witness. You. The complaint against you was designed to discredit whatever you might say about Ironfield before you said it." "And Marcus Vale?" Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Brink's face. "We're aware of Mr. Vale's situation. We have people at Kellerman Regional." "His files were partially recovered," Brink said. "He digitized approximately 60% of the material before his hard drive was wiped remotely. The physical copies were taken, but 60% is enough." Mara absorbed that. "What do you need from me?" she said. "A formal statement. What you saw. What you did. What you were told and by whom." Brink picked up the pen. "Your testimony about being removed from the official record is the only first-person account we have of how the suppression actually worked. Without it, we have financial records and indirect evidence. With it, we have a complete chain." The recorder on the table sat switched off between them. "You said that was off," Mara said, nodding toward it. "It is," Brink said. "Nothing is on record until you say it can be." "And Pollock?" "Is currently being asked questions in another part of this building by 2 of my colleagues who arrived this morning." Brink looked at her steadily. "He's not walking away from this, Ms. Hendricks, but I need your statement to make sure the people above him don't." Mara looked at the table. She thought about Hartwell, who had said 18 hours and don't do anything irreversible. She thought about the 18 hours being 15 hours from now. She thought about Marcus Vale in a hospital bed in Nebraska with defensive wounds on his forearm and files missing from his apartment. "I want one thing," she said. "Tell me." "Whatever comes out of this, the mission record, my testimony, all of it, I want my full designation documented. Not as a footnote, not as a suppressed addendum, on the primary record." Brink looked at her for a moment. "That's not something I can guarantee unilaterally." "Then get me to someone who can." Brink's pen moved across the legal pad. Then she looked up. "I can make that request. Make it confirmed, not requested." The 2 of them looked at each other across the table. "Okay," Brink said. Mara reached over and turned on the recorder. She opened her mouth to begin, and then her phone went off. Not the alert she'd been expecting from Rask, not Hartwell calling back early. A hospital emergency alert, the specific tone that meant a patient in acute distress requiring immediate response. And the patient number that appeared on her screen was the room number she had been in this morning, the room number she knew by a different label than its administrative designation, Curtis Bale. She was on her feet before she'd made a conscious decision to move. "I have to go," she said. "Ms. Hendricks, this is my patient." She was already at the door. "I'll come back." She went into the corridor at the fastest pace she could manage without running, which was fast, And she took the stairs because the elevator would take 40 seconds she didn't have. And she came through the door towards C to find two nurses and the on-call resident standing outside Curtis's room with the particular configuration of people who have tried something and aren't sure what to try next. The resident, Dr. Omar Fitch, 29 years old, 6 months out of residency, good instincts and not quite enough experience to trust them yet, turned when he heard her, and the relief in his face was immediate and specific. "He's not responding to verbal," Fitch said. "BP is dropping. We think he took something, but we found an empty pill bottle, but we don't know what or how much." She pushed past him into the room. Curtis was on the bed. He was conscious, but barely, his breathing slow and irregular in the particular pattern she recognized from a context most nurses in this hospital had never encountered. Not a standard overdose presentation, something more deliberate in the rhythm, the kind of thing that happens when someone has thought about a method rather than acted impulsively. She assessed in seconds. Airway clear, pupils unequal but reactive, respiration at 9 per minute and slowing. "What's in the bottle?" she said. One of the nurses handed it to her. She read the label, ran the numbers in her head against his weight and the likely time of ingestion and the current presentation, and said, "Get me the reversal kit and call for a crash cart as a precaution. He needs flumazenil, and if he doesn't respond in 90 seconds, we're intubating. Don't wait for me to ask again." Fitch said, "Are you?" "He's my patient," she said. "Do it." She pulled on gloves and went to Curtis's side and put her hand on his arm and said his name. Not loudly, not with the elevated clinical performance of someone who wanted their colleagues to see them doing the right thing. She said it the way you say someone's name when you're talking directly to the part of them that can still hear you. "Curtis," she said, "I'm here. You're going to hear some noise and some activity, and I need you to stay with me." His eyes moved toward her, not fully present, but oriented. The kit arrived. She administered the reversal agent and watched his respiration for 60 seconds with the specific quality of attention that had nothing to do with equipment and everything to do with having done this before in places where equipment was a luxury and attention was what you had. At 45 seconds, his breathing changed. At 60 seconds, his eyes opened with more coherence than they'd had a moment ago. Fitch exhaled behind her. One of the nurses said something she didn't catch. She kept her hand on Curtis's arm. "There you are," she said. He looked at her. His voice was barely audible. "Didn't think you'd come back." "I told you I would." He closed his eyes. She stayed in the room for the next 22 minutes, managing the stabilization and coordinating with Fitch, who was technically the attending, but who deferred to her throughout with the pragmatism of someone who understood that experience outranked paperwork in this moment. When Curtis was stable and the psychiatry team had been contacted with an emergency override, she stepped out of the room and stood in the corridor and allowed herself exactly 5 seconds to feel the specific exhaustion of having been at maximum capacity for the last 7 hours. Then she felt something else. She turned. At the far end of the corridor, Gareth Pollock was standing with one of Brink's colleagues, his hands visible, his posture the posture of a man answering questions he had not anticipated having to answer. He was looking at his phone. He looked up. He saw her. And the look on his face was not the look of a man managing a situation. It was the look of a man who had just received news that had changed the shape of everything. And the news was not good, and it was not about her. His colleague said something. He looked back down at the phone. She walked toward the nursing station. She picked up her phone and found a text from Rask sent 6 minutes ago, while she'd been in Curtis's room. The text said, "Marcus is awake. He told his sister where the backup is. It's not on a hard drive." She stared at the screen. Then Rask's next message arrived. He mailed it 2 weeks ago. Physical copies. Certified mail to a specific address. It's already been delivered and signed for. She typed, "What address?" His response came in 10 seconds, and when she read it, she went completely still in the middle of the nurse's station with the sounds of the ward moving around her, because the address Marcus Vale had chosen 2 weeks ago, with the careful forward thinking of someone who knew the ground was shifting and had prepared accordingly, was not a lawyer's office. It was not a government building. It was not a journalist or an advocacy organization or any of the obvious choices. It was a residential address in Denton, Missouri. And when Rask sent the name attached to that address in his next message, Mara looked at it for a long time before she understood what it meant. The name was Commander Sylvia Hartwell, retired. who had told Mara 18 hours ago that she would need time to find the primary mission file, who had apparently already had it for 2 weeks and had said nothing. She stood at the nurse's station for 11 seconds with the phone in her hand and the name on the screen and the sounds of the ward around her. And she thought about the call she'd made 3 hours ago, and the voice that had answered on the fourth ring, and the sentence that now meant something completely different from what she'd taken it to mean. If the day comes when it stops being a protection and starts being a weapon used against you, you call me. Hartwell had said that 7 years ago, at the end of a conversation about what would and would not be disclosed. In a debrief room that was not really a debrief room, but was more accurately a room where a decision had already been made and Mara was being informed of it. She had taken that sentence as a promise, a contingency. The kind of thing a commanding officer said when they were trying to be decent inside a situation that wasn't decent. She looked at the address again. Marcus Vale had mailed the backup files 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, Rask had not yet arrived at Hargrove with Scout. 2 weeks ago, Mara had not yet said Hartwell's name to anyone, had not yet thought about calling the number she'd memorized 11 years ago and never used. Whatever Marcus had known 2 weeks ago, and whatever had made him choose that address, was information Mara did not have and needed immediately. She called Rask. He picked up on the second ring. "You saw the address?" "I saw it," she said. "Why Hartwell? Does Marcus know her?" "I don't know yet. I'm trying to reach him through his sister. He's in and out." "Find out," she said, "before I call her back." She hung up and put the phone in her pocket and spent 4 minutes finishing documentation that could not wait, because she was still a nurse, and there were still patients on this floor, and the world had not actually stopped, even though the last 3 hours had felt like it. And then she went to the supply room and stood inside it with the door closed for 60 seconds, and let herself feel the disorientation of realizing that the one person she'd believed was fully in her corner had been holding a piece of this she hadn't known about. It didn't have to be a betrayal. It could be complexity. It could be Hartwell operating on a timeline and a strategy Mara wasn't fully seeing. The woman had survived 30 years inside military institutional structures that rewarded patience and punished premature action. She knew how to hold things until the moment was right. Or she had been holding something for 2 weeks and had not told Mara it existed. Both things could be true simultaneously. She went back to work. Rask texted at 4:15. Marcus was conscious and had spoken to his sister for 8 minutes. The gist, filtered through Denise and then through Rask and then to Mara's screen, was this. Marcus had been compiling the material for 4 years. 18 months ago, he had made contact with someone he believed was trustworthy, someone who had a military administrative background and a specific connection to the Ironfield mission record. He had sent preliminary documents to test the channel. The response he got back was not from that person directly, but confirmed the documents had been received and understood. 6 months ago, he had identified Hartwell as the most likely keeper of an unaltered mission file. He had not contacted her directly. Instead, he had sent the package to her address as an act of deliberate redirection, a way of forcing the file out of dormancy by putting the physical evidence in proximity to whoever held the original. He had not been certain she was trustworthy. He had been certain she was central. Mara read the message twice. Then she understood. Marcus had not sent the package to Hartwell because he trusted her. He had sent it to Hartwell because he wanted to see what she would do with it, whether she would sit on it, surface it, or make a move that revealed which side of the line she was standing on. He had used the package as a provocation, the same way you put pressure on a fracture line to see which direction it breaks. And then Marcus had been beaten up and put in a hospital, and the fracture line had answered the question. Hartwell had called no one, had reported nothing, had received a package full of classified evidence related to an operation she had been part of and had sat on it for 2 weeks while Talford moved on the people who were getting close. Or Hartwell had received the package and immediately understood what it was and had spent 2 weeks planning a response that was larger than anything Mara's single phone call could see from the outside. She needed to know which. She called the number again. It rang once. Hartwell picked up. "I was about to call you." "Marcus Vale sent you the files," Mara said. No pause. "Yes." 2 weeks ago." "Yes." "You didn't tell me this morning." Hartwell's voice was measured but not defensive. "No." "Why?" "Because this morning I wasn't certain you were ready to move," Hartwell said. And because the files alone aren't enough. They never have been. You can have every document in that package, and it doesn't matter if the person who authorized the suppression is still embedded and still has access to administrative override. She paused. I needed the investigation to reach a specific point before the files had weight. If I surfaced them too early, Talford's legal team buries them in classification challenges for 2 years and nobody goes to prison. Mara pressed 2 fingers against her temple. You knew about Brink. I've known about the IG investigation for 11 months. Sylvia, I know, Hartwell said. I know how this sounds. I kept you in the dark and people got hurt, and you are entirely within your rights to be angry. I need you to be angry later and operational now because Brink is at your hospital and she needs the files in the next 12 hours to execute the warrants before Talford's board gets wind of where the investigation has reached. The supply room was very small and very quiet. Where are the files? Mara said. My house, in a fireproof box in my office. A beat. I need you to come get them. So, she requested personal leave for the remainder of her shift, which was 2 hours, citing a family matter. The charge nurse approved it without question. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, put on the clothes she kept in her bag, and walked to her car. She texted Rask from the parking structure. Hartwell's house. I need you there. He responded in 40 seconds. Address? She sent it. Then she pulled out of the parking structure and drove across Denton in the early evening, through traffic that was ordinary in the specific way that ordinary things always were when you were inside something that felt like it had its own gravity, pulling everything toward a center you couldn't quite see yet. Hartwell's house was a small single story on a quiet street, the kind of house that told you exactly nothing about its occupant from the outside. Landscaping that was maintained but not designed. A car in the driveway that was practical and 8 years old. A porch light already on even though it wasn't fully dark yet. Mara knocked. The door opened in 6 seconds. Hartwell was in her mid-60s, compact and direct in the way she moved, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that tracked fast and constantly. She had the look of someone who had not been sleeping well, which Mara registered and filed. Come in, she said. The house was sparse. A lot of shelf space, a lot of books, a desk in the front room that had the organized density of a workspace that processed a significant volume of information. On the desk, a fireproof box, already open. Mara crossed to it without being invited. Inside were physical documents, 15 pages by quick count, and a sealed envelope with Marcus Vale's handwriting across the front. Beside the documents, a USB drive. The drive has the scanned copies, Hartwell said. The physical documents are the originals. I had them verified by a retired archivist when they arrived. The signatures are authentic. The date stamps match naval administrative records from that period. Mara picked up the top document and read the first page. It was the unaltered mission record for Operation Ironfield. Her name was on it. Her designation. Her role. The page listed 11 personnel, not 9. The 2 additional names being herself and a communication specialist named Darren Lowe, who had also been removed from the official version. She read the second page. It was an internal Talford communication, not a military document, a corporate one, authorizing what it called a record alignment procedure for Ironfield, with specific names, a budget line, and a signature from a Talford executive whose name she had seen once before on the Public Board of Directors Registry 48 hours ago. Warren Oakes, Executive Vice President, Talford Strategic Group. She set the document down. Oakes authorized it personally, she said. Authorized and oversaw it, Hartwell said. The person inside Naval Command who processed the record change was his contact. Payments were routed through 2 offshore accounts before landing in a domestic LLC. Brink has the payment records. She has most of them. The Talford communication is the link she's been missing. It puts Oakes directly in the chain instead of adjacent to it. Footsteps on the porch. A knock. Hartwell went to the door and came back with Rask, who had Scout on the leash and took in the room and the box and Mara's expression in 3 seconds without asking any unnecessary questions. We need to get this to Brink tonight, Mara said. She's still at Hargrove, Rask said. Does she have secure transport? She came with a team, he said. 2 other IG investigators. They have a vehicle. Mara looked at Hartwell. Is there anything else? Hartwell reached into the box and removed the sealed envelope with Marcus's handwriting. She held it out. He included a letter. I haven't opened it. She paused. It's addressed to you. Mara took it. She didn't open it now. She put it in her jacket pocket, picked up the physical documents, and looked at the USB drive. Can we duplicate this before we hand it over? She said. Hartwell pointed to a laptop on the desk. Already open. A second drive beside it. I made 3 copies the day it arrived, Hartwell said, with the expression of someone who had learned long ago not to rely on single points of failure. They drove back to Hargrove separately. Mara with the documents, Rask following. She parked, walked through the main entrance with the folder under her arm, and went directly to the second floor. Conference room B still had light under the door. She knocked and walked in without waiting. Brink looked up from a phone call, saw the folder, and ended the call in mid-sentence. Mara set the documents on the table. Brink went through them in 4 minutes flat, which was faster than Mara had expected, and indicated she had been looking for exactly this and knew what she was looking at. She reached the Talford corporate communication and stopped. She read it twice. Then she picked up her phone and made a call that lasted 40 seconds and consisted mostly of her reading a name and a document reference number into the receiver. She set the phone down. This is the chain, she said. I know, Mara said. How quickly can you give me a formal statement? Tonight, ideally. Now, Mara said. I'll do it now. Brink turned on the recorder. She stated the date, the time, the parties present. She looked at Mara and said, in your own words, start from the beginning. Mara started from the beginning. She talked for 41 minutes. She didn't embellish and she didn't minimize. She described the mission the way she remembered it, not the classified operational details, which were not hers to disclose, and which were not what Brink needed, but the administrative reality. What she was told at the debrief, the instructions she received, the specific language used, the person who had delivered them, and the understanding she had been given about what disclosing her involvement would cost. She described 6 years of working inside a system that used the cover-up as a lid on her credentials without her being able to object, because objecting would require explaining why the credentials weren't documented, which would require explaining the things she'd been told not to explain. Brink asked 3 questions, all of them precise. Mara answered all 3 without hedging. When the statement was done, Brink turned off the recorder. She sat back and looked at Mara for a moment with the expression of someone who has just confirmed something they needed confirmed and is making space for the weight of it. The warrant for Warren Oakes will be executed in the morning, she said. The embedded contact inside Naval Command is being handled simultaneously. We've had surveillance on him for 3 weeks. She paused. Pollock will be charged tonight. He's been cooperating for the past 2 hours, which has accelerated the timeline. What about Aldridge? Mara said. Brink was quiet for a moment. Aldridge is not a Talford operative, she said. He's a hospital administrator who allowed himself to be used by one because Pollock represented himself as legitimate oversight and Aldridge didn't ask enough questions. She met Mara's eyes. That's a different category of problem. His complaint against me will be withdrawn, Brink said, and the record will reflect the withdrawal. It wasn't everything. It was not going to undo 6 years or make the performance reviews disappear or give her back the promotion she didn't get because someone had manufactured a ceiling out of a cover-up. But it was the thing that needed to happen first, and it was happening. And she had learned a long time ago that you took the ground you could take and didn't mourn the ground you couldn't cover in a single day. I want the mission record corrected, she said. My designation, my name, my role, on the official record. That process will be initiated by Naval Command within 72 hours of the warrants executing, Brink said. I'll personally flag it. She held Mara's gaze. I'll flag it tonight. Mara nodded. She stood up. One more thing, Brink said. She stopped. The communication specialist, Darren Lowe. He was also removed from the record. Brink's voice was careful. He died 14 months ago. Heart failure, officially. His family has been told he had no active duty record beyond basic service. She paused. When the record is corrected, his family is going to learn things about who he was. The room was quiet. They deserve to know, Mara said. Yes, Brink said. They do. What? She found Rask in the first-floor corridor at 9:40 p.m., standing near the main entrance with Scout, both of them with the specific quality of stillness that comes at the end of a long day that required continuous alertness. Scout lifted his head when she approached. His tail moved once, which was apparently the Malinois version of significant enthusiasm. "It's done?" Rask said. "The statement is done. The warrants go tomorrow." She stopped beside him. "Pollock is cooperating." He absorbed that. "Aldridge?" "Not a knowing participant, which is somehow worse in its own way." He looked at the main entrance doors. "Marcus is improving. His sister says he was sitting up this afternoon." "Good." A moment of silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable. The kind of silence that exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to perform the processing of it aloud. "What happens to you now?" "Now?" he said. "The complaint gets withdrawn. The record gets corrected." She thought about it. "I go back to work." "Here?" She thought about Curtis Bale, about Ward C and the family meeting room and the medication error she'd caught that nobody else had, about the specific quality of work she did here and what it was for and whether the institution deserved her enough to justify the fight it had taken to stay. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Not tonight." He nodded. He didn't push it. She put her hand in her jacket pocket and felt the sealed envelope. She had not opened it yet. She was going to open it tonight, alone, in her apartment, in the chair by the window, when the day had settled enough that she could read what Marcus had written without the noise of everything else getting between her and the words. She said goodnight and walked to the parking structure. She was halfway to her car when her phone rang. Number she didn't recognize. Missouri area code, but not local. She answered. The voice was not what she expected. It was male, older, with the specific texture of someone calling from a medical environment. Background sounds she recognized. The kind of acoustic signature that belonged to a hospital corridor, equipment hum, and muffled intercom. "Is this Mara Hendricks?" the voice said. "It is." "My name is Colonel Bernard Ashby. I'm with Naval Personnel Command." He paused. "I've been asked to contact you regarding the Ironfield mission record." She stopped walking. "By whom?" "By the Chief of Naval Operations Office," he said. "We received a flag from the Inspector General approximately 40 minutes ago." Another pause, and in the pause was something she recognized as a man working through how to say something he had not said before. "Ms. Hendricks, I've been reviewing the original record for the past 30 minutes, the one that includes your designation." "I know what's in it," she said. "Yes," he said. "I imagine you do." He cleared his throat. "I want to be direct with you. What was done to that record was wrong. What was done to your service history was wrong, and I intend to correct it through proper channels starting first thing tomorrow." She leaned against a concrete pillar in the parking structure. "I've heard that kind of language before." "I know you have," he said, "which is why I'm calling at 9:45 at night instead of sending a letter." He was quiet for a moment. "I served with a man named Darren Lowe. Not well. We overlapped for 6 months in 2008. Good man. His family deserves to know who he was." She said nothing. "So do you," he said. She looked at the concrete ceiling of the parking structure and thought about 7 years in blue scrubs and 6 performance reviews and the elevator doors closing and Scout crossing a lobby floor and the photograph in that briefing room and Marcus's files in a fireproof box and all the ordinary days that had been stacked on top of something that had never actually gone quiet, that had been waiting the whole time with the patience of things that are true and cannot be made false by being buried. "I'll be available tomorrow," she said. 9:12 a.m., he said. "I'll call you." He hung up. She stood in the parking structure for a moment. Then she opened the envelope. Marcus's handwriting was the handwriting of someone who had been educated in an era that still taught penmanship, careful and slightly formal, with the slight irregularity of a man who didn't write by hand very often anymore. The letter was 2 pages. She read it standing there in the concrete and the fluorescent light with her car 20 feet away, and she read it from beginning to end without stopping. He had written, "I don't know if this reaches you before everything else does, or after, or whether any of it works out the way it's supposed to. I've been sitting with this for 4 years, and the only thing I know for certain is that what happened to you was not okay, and I could not keep living with the silence of it. You stayed behind. You treated everyone you could reach, including the dog, and you were the last one out, and then they took your name off the page like you were never there. That's not something I can explain or excuse. It's something I can try to fix. I'm sorry it took this long." She folded the letter and put it back in her pocket. She got in her car. She sat for a moment in the driver's seat with her hands on the wheel, not yet moving. Tomorrow was going to be complicated. The warrants. The naval personnel call at 9:00 a.m. Aldridge and whatever came of the withdrawn complaint and what it meant for his position and hers, and the 6 years of professional friction that didn't resolve cleanly just because the underlying cause of it had been exposed. Curtis Bale, who was alive tonight and would need someone to show up again tomorrow and the day after. Scout, who was recovering and would need his recheck appointment in 10 days. The record correction process, which Ashby had described as starting tomorrow, but which she knew from experience moved at the speed of institutional machinery, which was not fast. All of that was true, and she was going to deal with all of it. But first she thought about the thing Brink had said, very quietly, near the end of the statement, not on the record, just as Mara was gathering her things, which was, "The person who authorized the suppression of your record spent 7 years believing you were contained, that you had agreed to disappear and would stay disappeared." She had paused. He's going to find out tomorrow morning that he was wrong about that. Mara had nodded. She had not said what she was thinking, which was that Warren Oakes was not the only thing she was thinking about, and that the thing she was thinking about was not anger exactly, and not satisfaction exactly, but something smaller and more specific. She was thinking about the word contained. She was thinking about the 6 years during which the word had been accurate. And she was thinking about the moment in Conference Room B, 41 minutes of clear and precise testimony, with the recorder running and Brink across the table and the Talford document in front of them both, when the word had stopped being accurate forever. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. A message from a number she now recognized as Rask, but the message was not from Rask. It said, "This is Sylvia. I needed to tell you something I should have said this morning. The original record, the unaltered one. It lists your actions during the final hour of the mission. I've read it 3 times in 2 weeks. I want you to know what it says." She stared at the screen. Then the next message arrived. It says you remained at the exfil point for 47 minutes after the last personnel were evacuated. It says you treated 4 critically wounded under sustained fire. It says you were the final person extracted, and that extraction was delayed because you refused to leave a military working dog with a compound fracture behind. A pause. Then, the dog's name was Scout. The parking structure went very quiet. Her hands were still on the wheel. The phone screen had gone dark. She turned it back on and read the last message again, and then she sat there with the specific weight of understanding something she had not known, something that connected the beginning of the story to the end of it in a way she could not have planned, and Marcus could not have planned, and Rask certainly could not have known when he walked through Hargrove's doors with a Belgian Malinois on a leash and a transfer file, and the worn certainty of a man who believed he was bringing a dog somewhere to get help. Scout had been there. Scout had been the dog. And he had crossed 30 feet of polished hospital floor and sat down at her feet. Not because of training, not because of instinct alone, but because somewhere in the deep animal architecture of a dog, who had been carried out of a firefight by a woman who refused to leave him, the memory had not gone away. She sat with that for a long time. Then her phone buzzed one more time, and this message was not from Hartwell. It was from an unfamiliar number with a Virginia area code, and it contained no greeting and no signature and only 4 words that made her sit up straight in the driver's seat with the sudden cold clarity of someone who has just realized the night is not over. It said, "We need to talk." She looked at the 4 words on the screen for a long moment. "We need to talk." Virginia area code. No name, no identification. Sent at 9:58 p.m. on the night before federal warrants were scheduled to execute against a defense contractor whose executive had spent 7 years believing a specific problem was contained. She thought about answering it. Then she forwarded the message to Brink with a single line. "Received this 60 seconds ago. Virginia area code. Unknown number. Thought you should see it before I respond." Brink's response came in under 2 minutes. "Don't respond. We'll trace the number. Stay home tonight." She put the phone in her bag and started the car. The drive home was 20 minutes through a city that was doing its ordinary nighttime things. Restaurants emptying out, traffic thinning, the specific quality of a weeknight winding down. She drove without music. She thought about Scout, and about 47 minutes, and about the particular cruelty of the word contained applied to a person, and about Warren Oakes, who had sat in a corporate office in Virginia for 7 years, and had occasionally thought about a Navy trauma nurse in Missouri who had agreed to disappear and had then done exactly that, and who had probably not thought about her very much at all in recent years, Because people who have power over other people's silence tend to stop thinking about the silence once it holds. She parked. She went upstairs. She sat in the chair by the window and did not turn on the television, and did not open her laptop, and did not do anything except sit there in the particular quiet of her apartment, which she had always kept spare precisely because spare spaces didn't ask anything of you, and let the day settle into its proper shape. It was a big shape. It didn't fit neatly. She was still there when her phone rang at 11:15. Brink. The number belongs to a prepaid phone purchased in Richmond, Virginia, 3 days ago, Brink said. We can't get a purchase ID tonight, but Richmond is where Talford's corporate headquarters is located. A pause. Someone in that organization knows the warrants are coming. We don't know how. What does that mean for tomorrow? It means we move earlier, Brink said. 6 o'clock a.m. instead of 9 o'clock. The naval personnel contact will still reach you at 9 o'clock. That timeline doesn't change. But the warrant execution is being moved up. She paused again. It also means we're extending protection to you tonight. There will be a vehicle outside your building. Mara looked out the window at the street. She hadn't noticed a car yet, but she would look again in a moment. Is that necessary? She said. Probably not, Brink said. But probably not isn't the same as definitely not, and I'm not willing to make that call at this point in the investigation. All right, Mara said. She went to bed at midnight. She slept badly, in the fragmented way she always slept when something large was in motion, and she was awake before her alarm at 5:30 and had coffee made, and was standing at the window when the sky began to lighten and the street below was still quiet, and the unmarked car she could now identify by its position near the corner had not moved all night. Her phone rang at 6:43. It was Brink. Not a text, a call, which meant something worth saying out loud. Warren Oakes was taken into federal custody at 6:17 a.m., Brink said. His residence in McLean, Virginia. The embedded naval contact was simultaneously detained at his home in Annapolis. Pollack's cooperation agreement was finalized at 5 o'clock a.m. His testimony is part of the evidentiary package. A beat. Meridian Institutional Advisors has been referred for dissolution. Talford's federal contracts have been suspended pending investigation. Mara stood at her window with the coffee in her hand and the morning light coming in at a low angle. Oakes, she said. What are the charges? Procurement fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, and conspiracy to suppress official military records, Brink said. The last one carries a significant sentence on its own. Combined with the fraud, he's not going to practice in any federal contracting context again. And the people above him on the financial chain are being identified. This doesn't stop with Oakes. She hadn't expected to feel much when the moment came. She had been carrying the story of that night for long enough that she had learned to store it in a place that didn't hurt on ordinary days, and she had assumed that whatever the resolution looked like, it would feel muted, the way things feel when you've waited so long for them that the anticipation has burned off, and what's left is just the fact of it. It wasn't muted. It was quiet, which was different. It was the specific quiet of something that had been making a sound for 7 years, low, constant, below the threshold of conscious hearing, finally stopping. Thank you, she said. You did the hard part, Brink said. You stayed. Colonel Ashby called at 9:03 a.m. 3 minutes late and apologized for it without making a production of the apology. He had a straightforward voice and a direct manner of speaking that she appreciated, and he walked her through the process of the record correction with the kind of specificity that indicated he had already begun it, not merely planned to. The primary mission record for Operation Ironfield would be amended to include all 11 personnel. Her designation, Navy Combat Trauma Specialist, seconded to Naval Special Warfare Support, would appear on the primary document. Her role would be described as written in the original, the medical support lead for the final 70 minutes of the mission, including the exfil phase. There's a commendation recommendation in the original file, Ashby said. It was never processed because the record was altered before it reached the appropriate desk. We're reinstating the recommendation. It will go through the standard review process. That's not necessary, she said. It was recommended by the mission commander, Ashby said, a lieutenant commander who has since retired. He made the recommendation the day after the mission and had no knowledge it had been suppressed. A pause. He'd like to speak with you, if you're open to it. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. I'm open to it. One more thing, Ashby said. Darren Lowe's family. His daughter has been notified through official channels that her father's service record is being amended. She was not given details yet. She'll receive those through a formal briefing with a liaison officer. He paused. His daughter is 23. She told the liaison officer she always knew her father had done something important. She just didn't know what. Mara put her hand on the kitchen counter and pressed it flat against the surface. Good, she said. She meant it. She went back to Hargrove that afternoon. Not because she had to. She had personal leave available, and Brink had suggested she take it, but because Ward C had patients who expected her, and Curtis Bale had a follow-up psychiatric appointment at 2 Hauteux that she wanted to make sure he attended, and because the work did not stop being the work simply because the context around it had shifted enormously in the last 18 hours. She changed into her scrubs in the locker room. Liz was at the station when she came through and looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had heard things. The withdrawal of the complaint was already known, hospital gossip moving at its usual speed, and who had the sense not to turn knowing things into a performance. Curtis had breakfast this morning, Liz said, both rounds. Good, Mara said. She did her rounds. She did them the same way she always did, thoroughly, without drama, with the particular quality of presence that made patients feel like the most important thing in the room without making a project of it. She changed dressings. She caught a documentation inconsistency on a post-op chart. She spent 11 minutes with a veteran named Gail Sutton, who had been at Hargrove for 3 weeks and had developed the institutional quality of someone who has started to believe they are primarily a patient rather than a person. And she talked to him about the fishing boat he'd mentioned once in passing, and made sure she remembered the name of the lake. Dr. Aldridge appeared at 3:15. She had been expecting this conversation and had not looked forward to it, which was different from being afraid of it. She stopped what she was doing and waited. He looked like a man who had spent the night revising his understanding of a situation he thought he'd controlled, and the revision had not been comfortable. He stood with his hands at his sides and he said, without the professional smoothness he usually deployed, "The complaint has been formally withdrawn. HR has been notified. Your personnel file will be updated." "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He didn't move. She waited. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it clearly, because I think I owe it to you without caveats." He met her eyes. "I didn't know what Pollock was. I should have verified his credentials more carefully before I engaged with his complaint, and I didn't. And I've been using the absence of documentation in your record to override your clinical judgment for years, and I should have looked harder at why the documentation had gaps." He paused. "I don't expect that to resolve anything between us. I just wanted to say it directly." She looked at him for a moment. He had not done a good job by her. He had not done a bad job out of malice exactly, but out of the particular institutional arrogance of a man who had never had to question his own position because his position had always been confirmed by the structure around him, and that kind of arrogance had real costs even when it wasn't intentional. "I appreciate you saying it," she said, directly. He nodded again. He left. She went back to her charts. She did not feel magnanimous exactly. She felt the way you feel when you've been running against wind for a long time and the wind changes. Not triumphant, not entirely, but aware of the difference in your own movement, the specific relief of forward motion that doesn't require constant bracing. Rask came at 4:30 with Scout, who walked into the hospital lobby with significantly better gait than 8 days ago, the hitch in the rear leg reduced to something barely visible, the overall quality of his movement more fluid and less managed. He had his ears up and his attention distributed in the alert, comfortable way of an animal whose pain has been reduced to a level that doesn't require constant compensation. She met them in the lobby and crouched down, and Scout pressed his nose against her palm and held it there for a moment with the specific deliberateness of an animal who has decided something and is acting on the decision. She put her hand on the top of his head. "His mobility is significantly improved," she said, without looking up. "He ran this morning," Rask said. "Not far, maybe 30 feet, but he ran." She stood up. They walked to the consultation room where this had started 8 days ago, which felt much longer than 8 days ago, and she did a proper examination of Scout's hip, the wound site, the range of motion, the muscle response, and wrote her notes and told Rask what the next 6 weeks of recovery should look like, what activities were appropriate, and what to watch for. When she finished, Rask said, "What are you going to do?" She'd been thinking about this. Not constantly, but in the spaces between other things, which was where real decisions tended to form. "I'm going to stay," she said. He waited. "Not because it's comfortable," she said. "It's not going to be comfortable. Aldridge is still here. The institutional dynamics don't change overnight just because the surface changes. But there are patients on this floor who have nobody else advocating for them with the specific experience I have, and walking away would be the easier thing, and the easier thing isn't always the right thing." He nodded. He understood that kind of calculus. It was the calculus of people who have chosen to stay in hard places for the right reasons. "Hartwell told me something this morning," he said. She looked at him. "The mission commander, the one who made the commendation recommendation." He paused. "His name is Lieutenant Commander Rex Farrow, retired. He said he put your name in for the recommendation because he had never in his career seen a trauma specialist perform the way you performed that night. He said, and I'm quoting him as accurately as Hartwell relayed it, "She treated 4 people in conditions that should have been unsurvivable, and then she picked up a dog and walked out last." The consultation room was quiet. "He wants to meet you," Rask said. "I know," she said. "Ashby told me." She looked down at Scout. "I'll meet him." A beat. "Are you okay?" Rask said. Not as a pleasantry, as a genuine question from someone who had seen enough to understand the difference between a person who was functioning and a person who was fine. She thought about how to answer that. "I've been doing something for 6 years that nobody knew I was doing," she said. "Holding a version of myself that wasn't the complete version, and doing it so consistently that I'd almost stopped noticing the parts that were missing." She paused. "I'm not sure what okay looks like from here, but I think I'm in a better position to find out than I was a week ago." He held her gaze for a moment. "That's an honest answer. I've run out of reasons to give any other kind." The news broke publicly 4 days later, not through a press conference, through a financial trade publication that had been tracking Talford Strategic Group's federal contract portfolio for other reasons, and had sources inside the procurement agency that received the suspension notice. By evening, 2 national outlets had picked it up and were reporting on the arrest of Warren Oakes on federal charges, including obstruction and conspiracy related to the suppression of military mission records. The word suppression appeared in most of the headlines. The word records was vague enough that nobody outside the investigation knew specifically what they referred to, which was appropriate. The operational details of Ironfield were still classified and would remain so. And the human element of the suppression was a personnel matter that moved through official channels rather than public reporting. What the public knew was, a defense contractor executive had paid someone inside Military Administrative Command to alter official documents. He had done it to protect his company's access to naval contracts. He had done it at the expense of service members who had been erased from their own service histories. The story had traction, not spectacular traction, not the kind that drives weeks of coverage, but the serious, persistent kind that attaches to institutional wrongdoing when the institution is federal and the wrongdoing has a specific human face. Mara read the first article in the break room at Hargrove, on her phone, between a patient visit and a shift handoff. She read it once, noted that her name did not appear, it would not appear anywhere publicly, and she had not wanted it to, and put her phone away. Liz appeared in the doorway with 2 coffees and handed one across without ceremony. "That's the one," Liz said. Not a question. "That's the one," Mara confirmed. Liz looked at her for a moment with the careful directness of someone who had worked beside her for 6 years and had spent most of that time knowing something was incomplete without being able to name what it was. "I always thought there was more to you than you were putting on the table," she said. "I didn't know what it was." "I know," Mara said. "I should have pushed harder when Aldridge went after your recommendations." "You couldn't have known why it mattered." "I knew it mattered because your recommendations were right," Liz said flatly. "That should have been enough." Mara held the coffee and looked at her colleague of 6 years and thought about the particular texture of institutional silence, how it didn't require collaboration to sustain itself, how it ran on the ordinary inertia of people not pushing, not because they were complicit, but because pushing against invisible walls is exhausting, and most people had enough of their own exhaustion to manage without adding to it. "We're okay," Mara said. Liz nodded once. "Good." She picked up her own coffee. "Curtis is asking for you." She went to Curtis Bale's room at 11:40. He was sitting up. Not the careful institutional sitting up of someone following instructions, but the ordinary, slightly crooked posture of a person who was in the process of becoming a person again rather than a patient. There was a book on his nightstand he hadn't read yet. His breakfast tray was mostly empty. "You look better," she said. "I slept," he said. "Don't make a thing of it." She sat in the chair beside the bed. "The psychiatrist said the new medication regimen is showing early positive response." "He said that?" Curtis made a face. "Early positive response. That's what they call sleeping." "It is, actually." Looked at her sideways. "I heard some things. About the VA. About a contractor getting arrested. You shouldn't listen to hospital gossip." "I'm a captive audience." He shifted in the bed. "Is it true that they had someone's name taken off a mission record?" She looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I thought." He turned toward the window. "That happens more than people know. People do the work and then the record gets cleaned up, and the people who were there are just gone." He paused. "Happened to guys I know." "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You gonna be okay here? After everything?" "I'm gonna try," she said. He looked back at her. "You know what the difference is between trying and doing?" "Tell me." "Nothing," he said. "Trying is doing. People just call it trying when they're scared it won't work. But the action is the same." He turned back to the window. "You've been doing this for 6 years. You'll keep doing it." She sat with him for a few more minutes without either of them needing to fill the space. Then she said she'd be back tomorrow, and he said she didn't have to, and she said she knew, and she left. 3 weeks after the warrants executed, Mara received 2 things on the same day. The first was a letter from Naval Personnel Command. Official letterhead, formal language, the dense institutional prose of military administrative documentation. It confirmed that her service record had been amended to reflect her full designation and role, that the suppressed commendation recommendation had completed the review process and had been approved, and that the Navy Commendation Medal, recommended by Lieutenant Commander Rex Farrow following Operation Ironfield, was hereby formally awarded, along with a request that she indicate her preference for a ceremony or private presentation. She read the letter twice at her kitchen table in the morning. Then she set it down and looked at the wall. She had not done what she did that night for a medal. She had not even done it for recognition. She had done it because there were people who needed treatment, and she was the person present who could provide it, and that was the entire decision tree, beginning and end. The commendation was a document that reflected a bureaucratic acknowledgement of something that existed whether or not the bureaucracy acknowledged it, and it landed differently than she'd expected. Not as validation exactly, but as a kind of return. The part of her that had been in that record, unnamed, for 7 years, coming back with a name on it. She checked the box for private presentation. The second thing that arrived was a phone call from Marcus Vale. She had spoken to him once by text since the night she'd read his letter in the parking structure. A brief exchange to confirm he was recovering, and she had received his words. The call was the first time she had heard his voice. He sounded like a man who had been hurt and was coming back from it with the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided that what they were trying to accomplish is still worth accomplishing. His voice was slightly rough, and he laughed once in a way that caught on something painful, and he didn't pretend he was further along than he was. "I wanted to say it out loud," he said, "not just on paper." "You already said it on paper," she said. "That was enough." "It wasn't, actually," he said. "The paper was the thing I could do from a distance. This is the thing I have to do with my voice." He paused. "What you did that night, staying behind, treating everyone you could reach, carrying Scout out. We all knew. Every person on that team knew, and then they took your name off the page and we couldn't do anything about it. And that—" He stopped. "That is something I will not be okay with until the day I die, and I needed you to hear me say that directly." She sat very still on the other end of the line. "I'm going to tell you something," she said. "I've spent 7 years believing I should have saved more. That the 2 I couldn't reach were a failure of mine specifically. That if I'd been faster or made different calls or had more equipment, they'd have made it out." "Mara, I know," she said. "I know that's not how it works. Intellectually, I've always known that. But there's what you know and there's what you carry, and those aren't always the same thing." She exhaled. "Reading your letter helped with the carrying. I wanted you to know that." He was quiet for a moment. "How is Scout?" She smiled. It was involuntary, which was the best kind. "He ran 30 feet 3 weeks ago. He's up to about 200 yards now. Rask says he's been trying to chase squirrels." Marcus laughed, and this time the catch in it was softer. "Of course he is." "He's going to be okay," she said. "So are you," he said. "Both of you." The private presentation took place 6 weeks after the letter. It was in a small conference room at a naval administrative facility, not in Denton, but in a city 2 hours away, and it was attended by Colonel Ashby, who had organized it, and Sylvia Hartwell, who had driven from her house and sat in the second row with the upright posture of a woman who was managing several complicated feelings at once and was not going to let any of them surface inappropriately, and Commander Joel Rask, who stood at the back of the room with Scout beside him, the dog sitting in perfect military stillness, with his amber eyes tracking the proceedings with the alert calm of an animal who has decided this particular room is safe. Lieutenant Commander Rex Farrow, retired, was 71 years old and walked with a cane and had the specific quality of a man who had spent a long career carrying weight and had made his peace with most of it. He stood at the front of the room when Ashby introduced him and looked at Mara with the directness of someone who has been wanting to do something for a very long time and is finally in a position to do it. "I'm going to say one thing before the formal part," he said. "And the one thing is this. I wrote that recommendation the morning after the mission. I wrote it because in 31 years of service I saw a lot of exceptional people under exceptional pressure. And what I saw that night was something I had no other framework for except to put it in writing and send it up the chain." He paused. "When it never came back, when nothing came of it, I told myself it had been lost in the administrative shuffle. I believed that because the alternative, that someone had deliberately made you disappear, was something I didn't want to hold." He looked at her steadily. "I should have pushed harder. That's the truth of it, and I wanted to say it before I put this in your hands." She stood in front of him and received the medal. She was not going to describe how that felt, even to herself, in any language that would make it sound like something other than what it was, complicated and earned and 7 years late and real. She thanked him. He shook her hand with both of his and said, "The Navy got it wrong and then got it right. That's not the order it should have happened in, but it's where we are." "It is," she said. Driving back to Denton that evening, she thought about what it meant to be known. Not famous, not publicly validated. Known. The specific thing of having the true record exist somewhere, accurate, with your name on it, reflecting what actually happened, rather than the version someone found convenient. She had lived without that for 7 years, and had built a functional life inside the absence, and the life had been real, and the work had mattered, and the patients she'd sat with, and the errors she'd caught, and the mornings she'd shown up. All of that was true regardless of whether anyone outside Ward C knew who she was. But the absence had cost something. A person could manage the cost, could absorb it and keep moving, but the management itself took energy, and the energy came from somewhere. And what it came from was the part of you that might otherwise have been used for something else. She had not known how much she was spending on the management until she stopped spending it, and the stopped spending felt like taking off something heavy she had been wearing so long it had stopped registering as weight. She drove and thought about Curtis Bale, who had told her that trying and doing were the same thing, and about Liz, who had handed her coffee without ceremony, and about Gail Sutton and his fishing lake, and about the veteran in Ward C whose medication had nearly been wrong, and about all the ordinary mornings that were the actual content of the work. She thought about the word contained. She thought about how the people who use that word about other people are always, eventually, wrong. Not because contained people inevitably break out. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they choose the quiet and the quiet holds. But because what they're trying to contain is not a threat. It's a truth. And truths don't require drama to persist. They just persist. They sit in the record, even when the record has been altered. They sit in the memory of every person who was present. They sit in the way a dog crosses a lobby floor towards someone he recognizes. They wait. And eventually, the waiting ends. She pulled into Denton as the last of the light left the sky, and the city settled into its evening rhythms, and she parked her car and went upstairs and sat in the chair by the window with Marcus's letter on the table beside her, and the medal in its case on the kitchen counter, and the phone in her hand, not making any calls, just holding it. Tomorrow she would go back to Ward C. She would check on Curtis, who was improving in the way that real improvement happened. Inconsistently, with backslides, with days that looked like regression and then turned out to be foundation. She would do her rounds. She would catch what needed catching and sit with who needed sitting with and advocate where advocacy was needed and hold the line where the line needed holding. She would do it under her own name, with her own full record, as the person she actually was. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything. She had walked into a military operation at 29 years old and stayed 47 minutes past the last extraction and carried a dog out on her own because leaving him behind was not something she was capable of choosing, and then she had walked back into the world and put herself inside a hospital and given 6 years to people who needed what she had. And she had done all of that without anyone knowing the full measure of it, and the work had been real every single day regardless. But there was something about being known, something about the record being right, something about the truth being the truth. Not just in the rooms where she'd lived it, but in the places that officially counted, stamped and dated, and signed by someone with the authority to make it permanent. She had not done any of it to be recognized, but she was not going to pretend that recognition meant nothing. It meant something. It meant she could walk into Ward C tomorrow without a single ounce of her being spent on the management of an absence. It meant every decision she made from this point forward was made as the complete version of herself, not the careful, curated version that had learned to leave certain rooms of the house locked. It meant the nurse and the combat medic, and the woman who had stayed behind, and the woman who had chosen the quiet life, and the woman who had refused to leave a dog with a compound fracture. All of those were the same person, and the same person did not have to live in pieces anymore. She put the phone on the table. She looked out the window at the street below, where the cars passed and the lights were on in the apartments across the way, and the city moved in its unhurried nighttime manner, indifferent and ordinary, and full of people carrying their own weight in their own silence, doing the thing that needed doing because it needed doing, whether or not anyone was keeping the right record. She had been one of those people. She still was. The difference was that now the record was right, and the record was going to stay right. And nobody, not a contractor with a corporate address in Virginia, not an administrator who confused paperwork with authority, not anyone who had ever looked at a woman in blue scrubs and seen only a woman in blue scrubs, was going to change